Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks so much for coming along to this discussion. This talk sort of originated from two places. First, as an offshoot of my first published paper, which talks about the emotions of the undead in sagas, and my current pet project of finding ways to connect the medieval to the present and vice versa. My usual way of doing that is through 20th century American comic books. But horror movies came about because for that first paper, I used the title In the Folds of the Flesh, which is a 1970s Giallo film. Those keen-eyed among you will also notice that this presentation also has a horror title. Scream and Scream Again is a 1970 British horror film about murder and maybe aliens. I did try and look it up. Unclear if it's aliens. But it might not be about the Middle Ages nor the undead, but it provides a good baseline of what I'm discussing with you guys today, which is how horror in the Middle Ages is similar to and may influence the horror inclinations of modern day through a comparison between the medieval droger and the horror film. So, there we go. I'm not the first to study both Old Norse literature and horror cinema. The first person to do that is Carol Clover, who famously writes a book just called The Medieval Saga, and also writes Men, Women, and Chainsaws, which is about sexploitation and slasher films. Uh, at the same time, I'm not the first to enjoy kind of like this fun crossover in titles, as you can see on the screen with Armin Jakobsen's defining article about the Droger in Grethe saga, which is headed by the title The Fearless Vampire Killers, taken from the Roman Polanski film. However, there's not been a lot of work done to actually connect the two and actually look at the overlap that exists between the two, besides just the vast amounts of pun material available and kind of the inside jokes that already exist, as you can see here. So, what I want to do is connect them. Simple as that. Easy, right? So the way I'm going to do that is by taking a step back and first defining for you what I mean by droger and provide some context on what they are, what sagas they appear in, and then give you a few of the most famous examples of them. Then I will explore a few possibilities about how these themes and motifs of the undead have emerged in 20th century media, and lastly, I will argue that the true successor to the Droger of the Old Norse Icelandic saga is not something like a vampire or a zombie, but rather the slasher. So let's get started. What you see on the screen is a screen cap from the Dictionary of Old Norse Prose, which is a project headed by the University of Copenhagen, essentially outlining every single reference to every single word that exists in Old Norse literature. Um, and so as you can see, and on the middle of the screen, the search and filter 15 citations, that means there's only 15 known uses of droger in Old Norse prose. And it's defined as a word that means revenant, ghost, or apparition, and or specter. Other words exist in the language that are associated with the undead, but none of them are super popular either. Hoigbui, which is associated with mound or barrow dwelling undead, only has about 6 entries, and the more generic word for just a haunting, which is Reimlecker, has only 12. So, if we were kind of just looking at this linguistic evidence in isolation, we would assume that revenants were some rare phenomenon, right? But that's not the case. Sagas are abound with examples of the undead. It's just that they don't really have a specific name for them. While I can call them a droger or a revenant or just the undead more generally, or any number of things, to find the undead in Old Norse sagas, we have to look at things like what they do, how they do it, what they act like, what they look like, why they come back from the dead in the first place, and how the living react to this incursion by the dead. And there are generally two types of the undead in sagas, the walking dead and the barrow dweller. I came up with these names. You should be proud. But this is an extreme oversimplification, and I want to state that outright. If we actually were kind of trying to define different types of the undead and actually taxonomize them, we'd be here all day. That would be its own paper. But what I'm trying to do is show that the distinction is that one of them actively walks and seeks out their victims, and the other waits for people to enter into their burial mound. And it's the former that concerns us today. So if you're already kind of picturing zombies lurching towards their victims, you're kind of on the right track. But what makes the zombie so terrifying is its mindlessness, right? That it's lost its humanity and it's now being driven by the want to kill people and eat their brains. The Droger are more sophisticated than that. When they rise from their graves, it's because they know what they want, and what they want is very simply revenge of some sort. Each of the examples I'm going to be discussing are spiteful, angry men who have been wronged in some way, or at least they think they've been wronged in some way, and so come back to wreak havoc on the community and destroy everything they can. They target their friends and families and important members in their community to attack. Their goal is to isolate, destroy, drive people and animals mad with their presence, and they can only be stopped by their complete and total destruction, with their ashes burned and scattered to the wind. Otherwise, they'll just return once more. So, these sorts of Walking Dead are most commonly found in the Islandingasogur, translated as the Saga of the Icelanders. These sagas deal with the early settlement of Iceland and the conversion of Iceland from pagan to Christian. They're often considered to be some of the most literarily impressive of the sagas and more realistic than other sagas like legendary sagas or romances. It's ironic then that there are so many examples of the undead. And it adds to this theory that for a time, worries about whether the dead could or would rise would be real concerns in medieval Iceland. We might be able to understand why if we sort of place ourselves into the shoes of the medieval Icelander. With months of darkness and constant worries about harvests and survival, death would have been on their minds, right? It's a culture that is brimming with the potential for stories when they are stuck at home by the fire, with nothing to do until a few hours that the sun would appear, and these stories, much like campfire stories, could turn ghostly. In a culture that needed strong communal bonds to survive, what is scarier than someone who refuses to follow the rules? When society is constructed to keep people happy and safe, what is scarier than someone who tries to destroy that very society? In the dark and the cold, wouldn't you too fear that perhaps the dead could have unfinished business? The three examples I will cover are sort of quintessential to these questions and these concerns. The first is Thorolfur Bagifoter, which is translated as Thorolf Twistfoot from Erbygja saga. He returns from his grave 3 times over the course of the narrative to exact revenge on those he deems his enemies for having his selfish desires denied in life. The second is Vigga Hrauper, also known as Killer Hraup, from Laukstella saga, who is buried on his farm to keep anyone else from taking it over and causing destruction on any who attempted to do so. Lastly, and perhaps the most famous of the Walking Dead, is Glaumr from Grettis saga, also known as Glam. While the other two are older, more curmudgeon type men, somewhat ostracized from their community, Glaumr has no community to call his own. Instead, he is killed after being brought in to defeat a different monster and rises to terrorize his former employers. All three are disliked in life, all three terrorized during their haunting, and all three are incredibly hard to destroy, with lasting impacts on those that encounter them. So we'll start with Erbygja saga, translated as the saga of the people of Eir, as it's one of the most supernaturally dense of the sagas of the Icelanders, and that makes it a good jumping off point for us. So Thorolfur Bagifoter, as I said, Thorolfur Twistfoot, is the son of a well-known and well-liked woman named Gerith, who, after the settlement of Iceland, built a hall right across from the main road, and every traveler was expected to pass through it. In the hall stood a table always laden with food, which all were welcome to share, and for this people thought her the finest of women. However, this generosity is not shared with her son. When he is young, Thorolf fights with a man because he thought the land which his mother had taken was not nearly extensive enough. And it is from this encounter that he injures his leg and gets the nickname Twistfoot. He is a man defined both by his greed and by his narcissism, believing that he deserves everything he desires and is not afraid of hurting anyone who stands in his way, including his own son, Arnkel. Arnkel is warned by a witch as she dies that before this is over, you'll suffer more because of your father than my son has suffered because of me. The time will come when everyone will see what kind of a scoundrel your father is. Sure enough, it does not take long for this to manifest. Thorolfur attempts to steal another farmer's hay and has his oxen slaughtered for it. He then wants retribution for his killed oxen and is denied, so sends out his men to kill the farmer who, in his mind, has sold him out. When asked why he has done such a thing and why he doesn't want to reconcile with his son, he says quite forebodingly that those who wronged me must be put in their place. No matter how closely they may be related to me, show mercy to none of them. His breaking point comes when, after selling part of his forest to his son's rival, that man then cuts down the trees for timber, something that Thorolfr explicitly didn't want him to do. So, when his request for vengeance against that deed is denied once more, he went back home in a rage, for he could see how difficult it was going to be for him to get what he wanted. It was evening when he reached home, and he sat on the high seat without uttering a word to anybody. He ate nothing all evening and stayed in his seat when the rest of the household went to bed. In the morning, when they got up, Thorolfr was still sitting there, dead. This is the start of Thorolfr's hauntings. Though Arnkel and the others attempt to keep him laying quietly in his grave, it doesn't take long before a good many people found it more and more unpleasant to stay out of doors once the sun had begun to go down. As the summer wore on, it became clear that Thorolfr wasn't lying quiet, for after sunset, no one out of doors was left in peace. There was another thing, too. The oxen which had been used to haul Thorolfr's body were ridden to death by demons, and every beast that came near his grave went out of its mind and howled itself to death. Shepherds and farm hands begin to die as well. Animals go missing or drop dead, and nothing can graze in the valley anymore. People can't sleep as Thorolfr keeps them awake by riding the roof, and when he appears on the farm, he takes to haunting his widow, who was almost driven out of her wits, and eventually the strain of it killed her. Only Arnkel is able to stop him, and he reburies his father, ceasing the hauntings. And Thorolfr stays laying down, he stays quiet, until Arnkel is killed as well. Then Thorolfr rises again, taking to haunting neighboring farms as well, and it's clear that he would never stop until he had cleared the neighborhood of men, beasts, and all. So, he is disinterred from his grave, found to be uncorrupted with an ugly look about him. He was black as death and swollen to the size of an ox, but they managed to roll him down to the pyre and burn him. Still, he's not finished with his hauntings, with a bull on the farm having a unnatural, supernatural anger towards the men that defeated Thorolfr's ghost, most likely because Thorolfr's spirit has overtaken it. And it is not until this bull is driven out into the sea that finally, after years, Thorolfr can no longer rise. We then move to Laxdala Saga, also known as Saga of the People of the Laxadaular, the Laxadale. And this episode is very similar to Erebigya's, that the haunting is far more confined to just one singular homestead. Early on in the saga, we are introduced to a man named Hraup, who was of Scottish descent on his father's side, but his mother's family had lived in the Hebrides, where he was born. A big, strong man, he was never willing to back down, even when facing an opponent who was considered more than his equal. At some point in his life, however, he receives the name Viga Hrauper, translated as Killer Hraup. The assumption is made that he had committed some crime in the Hebrides and has now fled to Iceland to avoid persecution and start a new life. This doesn't mean that he's necessarily a reformed citizen. It is described that he's extremely belligerent and unfriendly, and it is this same belligerence that has led him to commit misdeeds for which he refused to make retribution. So, when he joins the community, it is said that most people cared little for Hraup. He pushed his neighbors around and had on occasion hinted at them that they could expect trouble if they showed anyone else more respect than they did him. Sure enough, even as he ages, he was becoming increasingly difficult to deal with. By now, he was so aggressive that his neighbors could hardly stand up to his attacks, and there was little that the men in charge could do to curb his aggression. In the end, what stops him is simply old age. What he's still, his mind remains focused on one goal, which is keeping his farm, Hraupstaðr, in his hands because he refuses to give it up to anyone. As he lays dying from sickness, he commands that when I'm dead, I want to be buried in the kitchen doorway. Have me placed in the ground upright so I'll be able to keep a watchful eye over my home. Whether it is the unorthodox method of burial or his own promise to keep watch, it becomes very clear very quickly that Hraupur is not staying buried. Because if it had been difficult to deal with him when he was alive, he was much worse dead, for he haunted the area relentlessly. It is said that in his haunting he killed most of his servants. To most of the people living in the vicinity, he caused no end of difficulty, and the farm at Hraupstaðr became deserted. With the farm in such a state, it is decided that Hrauper must be removed from the doorway and moved far away from men and animal to keep everyone safe. And it works for a little while. And then his son, Sumarlithi, inherits Hraupstauther, and everyone thinks the haunting is in the past. Until Sumarlithi went insane after having lived there only a brief while and died shortly afterwards. Whereas Thorolfr could be contained by the will of his son, Hrauper has no such predilections and returns once more to haunt over his farm. Finally, when it seems like there's no hope, a hero named Olaf the Peacock arrives to take over the farm. At first, he sees nothing wrong until there are noises from the cowshed. A servant goes to investigate but comes back to say, Hraup is standing in the doorway, reaching out for me, and I've had my fill of wrestling with him. So, Olaf faces off against the ghost. It said that Hraup gripped his spear just above the blade in both of his hands and gave it a wrench, breaking the shaft. Olaf made a run at him, but Hraup let himself sink back down to where he had come from, putting an end to their struggle. And in the morning, Olaf has Hrauper dug up, and sure enough, Hrauper's body was perfectly preserved. He, being Olaf, then had a large bonfire prepared and had Hraup's body burned and his ashes taken out to sea. No one else was harmed by Hraup's haunting after that. Hrauper's anger and destruction is centered around his farm and those that attempt to claim it for themselves, but is ultimately defeated by the one who has inherited his farm. And lastly, we have Grettis Saga, which its full title is Grettis Saga Ásmundarsonar, translated as the Saga of Grettir, son of Ásmund. It doesn't follow the mold of the previous two, as I said before, as Glaumr is not explicitly stated to be an older man, nor is he part of the community he ends up haunting. Instead, when a man named Thorhall finds his farm at Thorhallstead being haunted by some unknown beast, he is told about a shepherd named Glaum, who is from Sweden. His family comes from Sigsdaular. He came to Iceland last summer, and although not much for keeping company with other men, he is big and strong. When he arrives, he's described as extremely large and with a strange appearance, with wide open blue eyes and wolf gray hair, startling Thorolfr. Thorhall. Ugh. He agrees to fight the monster, but his time at the farm is riddled with problems because he sang no prayers, had no beliefs, was unbending, and he always had something foul to say. He was unpleasant in almost every way. On a fasting day during Advent, he demands food, and when he gets pushback from Thorhall's wife, he goes out into the snow in a foul mood. He's not seen for several days, so they send out a search party. Eventually, they find Glaumr lying a short distance away from them. He was black as hell and swollen as fat as a bull. They felt disgust at the sight and almost lost their courage. Still, they set about taking him to the church, but they were not able to move him beyond a small ravine a short distance away. It does not take long, of course, before people realized that Glaum was not lying there quietly. He became a scourge to the local people. Many lost their senses when they saw him, some of them never recovering. Immediately after Christmas, some people thought they saw Glaum inside the farmhouse. They were terribly frightened, and many of them fled the farm. Then Glaum took to riding the house in the evenings, so that the roof was nearly broken. Then he started walking about both day and night. Men scarcely dared to go up to the valley, even when they had reason to do so. A shepherd is found dead with every bone in his body broken. The farm is abandoned. Cows are sent into fits of madness, goring themselves and each other to death. Thorhall's daughter is driven insane until she dies because of the haunting. And all seems hopeless until Grettir arrives to Thorhallstead. He says that he can slay Glaumr, and though Thorhall does not have much confidence, he agrees to let Grettir stay and try. So, one evening, Grettir lies in wait in an empty hall, pretending to be asleep. He hears the door open and Glaumr sticks his head in. No longer is he a man, but a creature large and horribly deformed, with strangely oversized features. The two begin to wrestle, with Glaumr attempting to pull Grettir outside to kill him, and Grettir doing his best to stay indoors. However, their fight does end up tumbling outside, and Grettir is forced to make eye contact with the Droger, a sight that he said was the only one that ever scared him. With Grettir paralyzed with fear, Glaumr speaks, the only time that the walking dead in these examples have done so in their undead state. He says, "This much I can tell you. Your strength and stature which you have reached had you not sought me out are now reduced by half. You will never become stronger than you are now. Yet you are strong enough, as many will find out. You have become famous because of your accomplishments, but from now on you will fall into outlawry and killings. Most of what you do will now turn against you, bringing bad luck and no joy. You will be made an outlaw, forced always to live in the wilds and to live alone. And further, I lay this curse upon you. These eyes will always be within your sight, and you will find it difficult to be alone. This will drag you to your death. Grettir is able to maintain his strength and cut off Glaumer's head, burning his body until only his ashes remain, and burying them away from any man, woman, or animal. But the haunting remains in Grettir's mind, the words Glaumer spoke echoing in his thoughts. He has achieved great fame, and yet he is a shadow of his former self. It is said that because of his encounter, one thing he found was greatly changed. He had become a man so scared of the dark that he dared not travel alone after darkness fell, since he saw in his imagination all kinds of apparitions. Though Grettir saved the day and defeated Glaumer, there is no peace for him, and his life is forever changed by the event. So now that we've explored these disgruntled, vengeful Walking Dead examples, how can we craft a definition to compare modern horror concepts to? The setting is always isolated in some way. So when the Droger break that down and travel becomes unsafe, the community becomes trapped in their own home. Those who die are often unnamed and of a lower social class, or have family members that are driven mad before dying from the fear of encountering the undead. Those who live are young, either with some communal leadership role or someone who has the potential for it. The undead themselves are typically unlikable in life, and this opinion only gets worse after their death. They attack those that are either insignificant or directly connected to whatever revenge they are desiring, and do things specifically because they are disruptive. They kill livestock, make roads unusable, ride roofs of houses to keep people from sleeping, cause insanity, bring disease, turn into other shapes and forms to continue their hauntings. They are often not defeated during their first encounter, but the hero must try again and again before it finally sticks, when there is no longer a body to even resurrect. So, with all this in mind, how do we then draw the comparisons to modern horror? It's already clear that the undead episodes in the sagas of the Icelanders are horror episodes. I don't think we can doubt that, even if horror as a genre is not something that would be really known about or discussed in the Middle Ages. But as to the question of what modern horror is reminiscent or perhaps descended from the Droger, there are three different ways to approach it. First is whether to see there are any examples of a direct adaptation or clear inspiration. The second is to see examples of the undead rising from their graves to try and see connections in that way. The last, and I'll already tell you right now, most successful, is finding similar functions between the medieval and modern stories, where there is more than just the rising of the undead, but the presence of some, if not all, of the characteristics that I have listed previously. So let me show you. First is direct adaptation. I've found two main examples that I'll discuss with you. One is the creatures that are actually called Droger from the Norse-themed God of War games, and the second is the Whites brought back to life by the White Walkers in George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and its TV adaptation A Game of Thrones. On the surface, they are what we imagine the undead to look like. They are partially decomposed and have various armors and furs to make them look vaguely medieval in appearance, taking inspiration from the Norse undead, but they are mindless. There is no goal besides just violence towards whoever is nearby, a simple and primal hatred of the living merely because they are dead. For each property, of course, this makes sense, right? In a video game, you need an easy enemy to defeat in droves to gain points and level up your XP, and Viking zombies are a fun way to do it. In a high fantasy epic, it's equally necessary to give the villains power and an army to threaten the kingdom, and what is more horrifying than the dead coming back to life to kill the world of the living, right? However, they don't have any drives or motivations in their return from the grave, which I believe is integral to seeing a functional connection to the Droger. So we'll move on. So, what about examples of the undead that do arise with a specific purpose in mind? This brought me to two options, The Crow and Pet Cemetery. This time, we have characters who are brought back from the dead with a specific purpose and are solely determined to kill or at least seriously maim specific targets. In the case of The Crow, It's those who killed Eric Draven and his girlfriend, and in Pet Cemetery, it's a child returning to attack his family after being possessed by the spirit of a Wendigo. What stops me from completely accepting this as a modern equivalent is how they return from the dead, because both have some external supernatural force driving their actions. It's also important to note that those that come back from the dead are not evil in their lives, as we see with the Droger, but are corrupted after their deaths into something that's very different. Furthermore, neither has a hero figure that fights against the Revenant. Eric is our hero when we watch The Crow. And the father of the child in Pet Cemetery eventually succumbs to the evil power of the Wendigo. And so no one wins. This might be me splitting hairs, and we can discuss it in the chat later, but my point is that these examples are closer, but they don't have that same level of disruption, disorder, and just pure antagonism for me to confidently call them successors of the Droger. And so in my research, I found one horror genre that by and large does adhere to the functions and characteristics outlined in the sagas of the Icelanders to such an extent, which is the slasher film. In his seminal work, Blood Money, A History of the First Teen Slasher Film Cycle, Richard Noel summarizes the slasher film as a shadowy, blade-wielding killer responding to an event by stalking and murdering the members of a youth group before the threat she/he poses is neutralized. Aaron C. Anderson, in his thesis Rethinking the Slasher Film, Violated Bodies and Spectators in Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street, adds a crucial definition to the slasher villain, that they are essentially repressed aggressive instincts, turned back outward and then destroyed by the communities that created them, although through the open ending, they tend to escape and return. That, in essence, is the Droger. After all, it all returns to the function. So, I will take the next few minutes comparing our three Droger to the three most famous slasher villains of the 1970s and 1980s. Michael Myers from Halloween, Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, Part 2. So let's start with Halloween. John Carpenter's Halloween is typically lauded as the first of the teen slashers that came to dominate the 1980s, and it's a good place to start for the slasher as Droger comparison. Michael Myers is locked away as a child after murdering his sister, but one Halloween night he breaks out and returns to his hometown of Haddonfield, Illinois to kill again, this time targeting a young babysitter and her friends. In the script, Carpenter only refers to Michael as the Shape, or a boogeyman, arguing that Michael is pure evil and the personification of fear and violence coming to wreak havoc on small town USA. In the film, there's a bit more going on from what I can tell. His first stop after his escape is to return to his childhood home, now dilapidated and being sold off by the final girl, Laurie Strode's father. Laurie becomes a target because she is the one that he sees first on the property when her father asks her to drop off the key for his real estate company. In many ways, it's not unlike Rauper's haunting of his farmstead when people arrive to take it away from him after his death. This comparison between Michael and Rauper only strengthens in Halloween 2, a film originally meant to be the closing out of Michael Myers' storyline to change the series into a Halloween-themed anthology, which obviously never manifested. In the sequel, it's confirmed that Laurie was chosen as the victim not because she was just trespassing, but because she is actually Michael's baby sister that managed to escape his original attacks as a child. Again, like Rauper targets his own son and drives him to insanity, Michael chooses to stalk and haunt his own sister. Further comparisons can be seen in Halloween to the Draugr narrative. His attacks are centered only around Haddonfield, with small town America an apt replacement for isolated Icelandic farms. His victims are nameless or lower status characters, which, in the case of slasher film rules, that means those that are more liberal with their treatment of sex, alcohol, drugs, etc., and are usually young teenagers. And his main opponents are a family member and a higher status member of society, the latter being in the form of Dr. Loomis, the psychiatrist that had been in charge of him at the hospital. At the end of Halloween, Loomis shoots him 6 times, sending him falling off a balcony, and yet, when they look to find the body, there's no one there. At the end of Halloween 2, meant to be the true end to Michael, it is an interesting coincidence that he is caught in a fire, burning to ashes so that nothing of him remains. If we turn next to Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, the themes of vengeance, madness, and invulnerability are only strengthened from what we see in Halloween. In Nightmare, Freddy Krueger is accused of murdering children only to get off without punishment on a technicality, causing the parents of the town to hunt him down and burn him to death to avenge those he killed. Freddy does not stay dead as he's transformed into something of a dream demon who haunts the minds of the children of the parents who killed him, driving them to the brink of insanity until either he decides to kill them or they kill themselves. This concept of someone already disliked and committing crimes in life is seen in Hrauper and Thorolfer. But of the three, Glaumer is perhaps the closest connection to Freddy because of the psychological element. By dying badly, Glaumer returns to haunt those that he blames, just like Freddy does. There's also an interesting inversion, as the Droger take to riding the roof to disrupt sleep and draw their victims into a further state of unease, while Freddy actively uses his dreams and sleep as his playground for taking control of his victims. This sleep motif comes around again with those that fight against the villains. Both Grettir and Nancy Thompson, the final girl of Nightmare, pretend to sleep to draw in their opponents. While Grettir does not want to be dragged outside to keep the battle in his favor, Nancy wants to keep Freddy in the real world to weaken him. They both defeat their respective villain, but at severe damage to their psyches. Grettir is haunted the rest of his life by Glaumer's eyes, and Nancy's hair goes prematurely gray after her experiences with Freddy. In many ways, Nightmare makes explicit the psychological elements of the Droger narrative that often goes unexplored in medieval sagas. The rest of the Nightmare series continues this theme of Freddy's hauntings. In A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, we can see Freddy continuing his hauntings through a transfer of his consciousness into the body of the main character Jesse, something that's not dissimilar to Thorolfer's transfer of his rage and vengeance into the bull at the end of his time in Erbegja saga. Freddy is not pure evil like Michael, but represents a reprehensible man in a society that hates him in life and in undeath that is often found in examples of the Droger. There's Siren, that feels appropriate. I'm just gonna wait for that to pass. It has now passed. However, the best example of the slasher as Droger that I have found is the first appearance of Jason Voorhees as the villain in Steve Miner's Friday the 13th Part 2. The first Friday the 13th, directed by Sean S. Cunningham, has Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother, as the slasher, killing off camp counselors as revenge for the preventable drowning of her son in Crystal Lake years ago. Pamela falls closer to the realm of hagsploitation brought on by film that happened to Baby Jane, more so than Droger medieval narratives, as she never returns after being killed. Instead, the last scene in the original film shows the rotting corpse of Jason rising out of the lake. When comparing Jason to the Droger, the overlap is obvious. Jason dies in unnatural circumstances after being a character that the others seem to dislike or ignore. He is clearly the bullied child at the summer camp, and is never properly buried because they cannot recover his body. When he comes back, his body is swollen and disoriented, like we see from Thorolfer and Glaumer. He returns for revenge, both for his own death and for that of his mother. His hauntings are limited, at least for the first few films, just to Camp Crystal Lake. The camp functions as the farmstead in a way, with it being consistently abandoned and then repopulated, each cycle bringing new victims and new hauntings for Jason. And Jason, importantly, is a corporeal undead figure, something that separates him from Michael, a living man, and Freddy, an incorporeal demonic entity, aligning him even further with the Droger. His victims are those that remain in his domain but are more vulnerable, being young teens and those arriving to try and help them. He also continually escapes. At the end of part two, there's no body to be found, and he just keeps coming back again and again, each time gaining greater power and a wider expanse of his hauntings. It's simple but effective and extremely reminiscent of the Droger and the hauntings present in the saga of the Icelanders. So, with all this in mind, I'd just like to conclude with some general remarks about what I've discussed today, and specifically thinking about the benefits of crafting reception studies in this way, and how we are looking at characteristics that are shared between stories created with no intention of being connected with one another, and yet represent similar themes, motifs, and structures nonetheless. In essence, it shows how we as humans have not really changed all that much. We are still terrified of things that haunt us, that break the laws of nature, and that do not value social conventions or value community or anything like that. The only difference is the mode that these villains take on. Of course, this is not me saying that it's a perfect one-to-one comparison. Some of the most major elements found in slasher films, things like teen sexuality, treatment of female characters in The Final Girl, and the exploitation elements of violence are all absent from Droger narratives. And then, in the same way, all of the kind of saga era politics and the religious elements and things like that that are oftentimes key to Droger narratives and the sagas in which they're part of are not found in the slasher. Um, but that's okay. If we think about it, medieval sagas are created by clergymen for well-off patrons, whereas slashers are a continually subversive genre of pop culture arising in the 70s and 80s. And so we're not looking for perfect one-to-one comparisons, but the fact that there is any overlap at all in these very disparate genres is incredibly interesting. And that's the point that's worth noting. So now that we're coming to the end of my talk, I hope that you've kind of enjoyed this little exploration into the realm of medieval horror and the echoes we still feel in modernity, even in the most unlikely of places. And thank you very much for listening.